It's hard to look at wedding photos now, even other people's. The fluffy white dresses, the beaming smiles, the perfectly choreographed dances. They all trigger a gut-wrenching cocktail of grief, anger, and a shame I can't quite shake. It's like a phantom limb pain. I still feel the ache of what I thought I was going to have, even though it was ripped away from me in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. My name is Clara. I'm a graphic designer, 32 years old. Or at least, that's what I'd tell you if we met at a bar. Right now, survivor of a spectacular wedding implosion feels like a more accurate descriptor. I should probably get that printed on a business card. It all started with Ben. Ben was everything I thought I wanted. Tall, handsome in a boyish way, with a disarming smile and a genuine kindness that drew me in from the moment we met at a friend's barbecue. He was an architect, passionate about sustainable design, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world whenever we talked. Our engagement wasn't some grand romantic gesture. It was a quiet evening at home, a simple question whispered over takeout sushi, but it felt real, solid, like the foundation of something strong we could build together. Or so I thought. The first crack in that foundation appeared almost immediately in the form of Patricia, Ben's mother. Patricia wasn't just involved in Ben's life. She was the puppet master, pulling strings from behind the scenes, dictating every aspect of his existence with a subtle but iron grip. And now, apparently, mine. From the moment the ring was on my finger, Patricia descended upon the wedding, planning like a benevolent, if slightly overbearing tornado. At first, I tried to be understanding. She was excited for her son, right? This was her first, and only, Ben was an only child, getting married. It was a big deal, but her excitement quickly morphed into an overbearing control that left me feeling suffocated. It started small, suggestions about the venue. Have you considered the Hillcrest Country Club? It's so elegant. Even though Ben and I had our hearts set on a rustic barn venue. Then, the guest list. Are you sure you need to invite all those friends from college? They seem unrefined. Translation: they weren't wealthy and socially connected like her circle. It escalated from there. The color scheme. That shade of blush is a bit common, don't you think? Perhaps a more sophisticated shade of mauve. The menu. Lamb is essential at a wedding of this caliber. It adds a certain gravitas. The flowers. Those daisies are lovely, dear, but are they really appropriate for a formal occasion? Each suggestion was a thinly veiled criticism, a constant reminder that in Patricia's eyes, I wasn't good enough for her precious Ben. I wasn't sophisticated enough, wealthy enough, pedigreed enough. I was a working-class girl marrying into the closest thing Ben had to an upper-crust family, and she was determined to remind me of that at every turn. What made it worse was Ben's reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. Whenever I brought up Patricia's interference, his response was always the same, a dismissive wave of his hand and a placating, "She's just trying to help, Clara. You know how she is." How she is? How she is a master manipulator who's slowly but surely sucking the joy out of what should be the happiest time of our lives. How she is turning me into a stressed-out, Bridezilla-esque caricature of myself. How she is making me question everything I thought I knew about my relationship. But I didn't say any of that. I bit my tongue, smoothed down the invisible wrinkles on my dress, and tried to convince myself that Ben was right. She was just trying to help. Maybe I was overreacting. Deep down, I knew I wasn't. I saw the way Ben deferred to her on every decision, how his eyes constantly flickered to her for approval. His loyalty wasn't to me, it was to her. He was still her little boy, and I was just the interloper threatening to disrupt their perfectly constructed world. But I was in love, or, at least, I thought I was. And I desperately wanted to believe that things would change after the wedding. Once we were married, he'd see me as his wife, his partner, his priority, not just some woman he was expected to tolerate for the sake of family harmony. Once we were married, he'd finally stand up to her. Once we were married. So, I persevered. I spent countless hours poring over Pinterest boards, comparing linen swatches, and agonizing over seating charts. I wanted our wedding to be perfect, a testament to our love and commitment. I wanted to prove to Patricia that I was worthy of her son. But looking back, I realized I was playing a game I could never win. Patricia wasn't interested in being proven wrong. She was determined to maintain her control, to keep Ben firmly under her thumb, even if it meant sabotaging our marriage before it even began. And she was just getting started. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of frantic activity. Every spare moment was dedicated to last-minute details, confirming vendor contracts, finalizing the seating chart, again after Patricia helpfully rearranged it, and ensuring that every tiny detail was perfect. I became a whirlwind of bridal energy, fueled by caffeine and sheer determination. I think, in some twisted way, I was trying to impress Patricia. I wanted her to see how serious I was about Ben, how much effort I was willing to put into making our marriage a success. But every time I saw her, it was like walking into a minefield. One afternoon, I stopped by her house to show her the final draft of the seating chart. She was sitting in her sun-drenched living room, surrounded by porcelain figurines and floral arrangements that looked like they belonged in a museum. She barely glanced at the chart before launching into another tirade about the guest list. "Are you certain you need to invite your Aunt Carol?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "She's rather loud, isn't she? And her choice of attire is always questionable." Aunt Carol was my mom's sister, a sweet, if somewhat eccentric woman who always made me laugh. "She's family, Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "and I want her there." Patricia sighed dramatically. "Well, dear, I'm just concerned about maintaining a certain decorum. This is a very important day, after all." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure you can handle being a wife, Clara? Marriage is a lot of responsibility, you know. It's not all sunshine and roses." I clenched my fists, trying to control my rising anger. "I think I can handle it," I said, my voice tight. "I love Ben." Patricia just smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Love is never enough, dear. It takes more than love to make a marriage work." It wasn't just her words, it was her tone, her condescending gaze, the way she made me feel like I was constantly being judged and found wanting. And Ben? He just sat there, nodding politely, occasionally muttering, "Mom, don't worry," but never once defending me. It felt like a betrayal, a confirmation that he secretly agreed with her. As the wedding day drew closer, Patricia's interference escalated. She started making changes without consulting me, overriding my decisions with a casual disregard that made my blood boil. The worst instance was the caterer. I had spent weeks researching and interviewing different catering companies, finally settling on a small, family-run business that specialized in locally sourced organic food. Their menu was perfect, a blend of rustic charm and elegant flavors that perfectly reflected Ben and my style. Then, one morning, I received a call from the caterer, apologizing profusely. They had to cancel our contract. Apparently, Ben's mother had called them, claiming that we had decided to go with a different caterer. I was livid. I immediately called Patricia, my voice trembling with rage. "What did you do?" I demanded. She acted completely innocent, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. "Oh, darling, is there a problem? I simply thought I was doing you a favor. I know a wonderful caterer, a friend of mine, who specializes in these sorts of events. They're so much more experienced and reliable than that little company you chose." "You canceled my caterer?" I repeated, barely able to believe what I was hearing. "Without even talking to me?" "Well, dear, I just thought it would save you the trouble. You're so busy with everything else, and trust me, you'll thank me later. I know what's best for these things." I hung up the phone, shaking with fury. It wasn't just the caterer. It was the complete and utter disregard for my feelings, my choices, my entire vision for the wedding. She was systematically dismantling everything I had worked so hard to create. When Ben came home that evening, I confronted him. "Your mother canceled our caterer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked surprised, but not nearly as angry as I expected. "She did." "Oh, well, she's just trying to help, Clara. She knows a lot about these things." "Trying to help?" I exploded. "She's sabotaging our wedding. She's trying to control every single aspect of it. Don't you see that?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Clara, you're overreacting. My mom can be a bit intense sometimes, but she means well. Just try to be patient with her. It's a stressful time for everyone." "Patient?" I screamed. "I'm being patient. I've been patient for months, but I can't do this anymore, Ben. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when your mother is actively trying to ruin our wedding." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Clara, don't make this into something it's not. My mom just wants everything to be perfect for us." "Perfect for her," I corrected. "She wants it to be perfect for her, and you're letting her do it, Ben. You're letting her walk all over me." He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his silence a confirmation of everything I feared. I could feel the tension building, a knot tightening in my chest. But I didn't want to make a scene, not so close to the wedding. I swallowed my anger, took a deep breath, and tried to salvage what I could of the day I had dreamed of. Little did I know that Patricia had one more move to play, and it would be the one that would destroy everything. The night before the wedding was supposed to be a joyous celebration, a final moment of calm before the storm of the big day. My friends and family had gathered for a small rehearsal dinner at a cozy Italian restaurant, laughter and well wishes filling the air. I tried to soak it all in, to focus on the love and support surrounding me. I tried to ignore the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. Patricia, of course, was absent. She claimed she was under the weather and couldn't attend. It wasn't much of a surprise. She had been dropping hints all week about how stressed she was, how the wedding preparations were taking a toll on her health. She played the martyr card with Oscar-worthy skill. Ben seemed unconcerned. "She just needs to rest," he said, shrugging it off as if it were no big deal. "She'll be fine tomorrow." I wanted to argue, to point out how disrespectful it was for her to miss such an important moment, to remind him that this wasn't her day, it was ours. But I held my tongue. Tomorrow was our day, and I wasn't going to let her ruin it, not tonight. During the rehearsal, everything felt off. The pastor seemed distracted, mispronouncing our names and stumbling over the vows. The bridal party was disorganized, missing cues and bumping into each other. Even the usually reliable florist had delivered the wrong bouquets. It was like the universe was conspiring against us, sending a series of subtle warnings that something was about to go terribly wrong. Later that night, as I lay in bed at my childhood home, surrounded by my bridesmaids, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. Patricia's absence, her constant meddling, Ben's blind loyalty to her, it all felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. My bridesmaids tried their best to distract me with silly games and nostalgic stories. We looked through old photo albums, reminiscing about awkward teenage years and drunken college parties. They painted my nails, gave me a facial, and forced me to drink chamomile tea, all in an effort to soothe my frayed nerves. But even their efforts couldn't completely erase the unease that had settled over me. I kept replaying the events of the past few weeks in my mind, searching for a sign, a clue that I had missed. I kept wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was marrying the wrong person. "Are you okay, Clara?" my best friend Sarah asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "You seem distant." I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just nervous, I guess. It's a big day." Sarah squeezed my hand. "I know, but you and Ben are going to be great together. You love each other. That's all that matters." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that love was enough, that it could conquer anything, even Patricia. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patricia's smug face, heard her condescending voice, felt her subtle but persistent undermining. I tossed and turned, haunted by doubts and fears. Finally, as the first rays of dawn crept through the window, I gave up on sleep. I got out of bed, put on my running shoes, and went for a jog through the quiet neighborhood. The cool morning air helped to clear my head, but it couldn't completely dispel the darkness that had settled over my heart. In less than 24 hours, I would be married. I would be standing in front of all our friends and family, promising to love and cherish Ben for the rest of my life. And I was terrified. I told myself I was just thinking too much. I was letting my anxiety get the best of me. Everything would be fine. Once I walked down that aisle, once I said I do, Everything would fall into place. But as I ran, a cold wave of dread washed over me. I had a feeling, a terrible, sinking feeling, that my world was about to come crashing down. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a picture-perfect day that felt like a cruel joke. I woke up early, buzzing with a strange mixture of nervous energy and dread. The bridesmaids' chatter filled the air, but I felt strangely detached, as if I were watching everything unfold from behind a pane of glass. I went through the motions of getting ready. Hair, makeup, dress. Each step felt surreal, like I was playing a part in a movie I didn't want to be in. My bridesmaids tried to distract me with jokes and encouragement, but their words felt hollow, bouncing off the invisible barrier that had formed around me. As I slipped into my wedding dress, a delicate creation of lace and silk, I felt a momentary flicker of hope. Maybe everything would be okay. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe Ben would finally stand up to his mother, and we could start our life together, free from her interference. But as the ceremony approached, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ben. "We have a situation," it read. My heart sank. The room seemed to tilt slightly. My breath caught in my throat. What could be wrong now? I tried to call him, but he didn't answer. Instead, another text arrived. "Mom isn't feeling well. She needs me." I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was supposed to be our day, our moment. And yet, here he was, putting his mother's needs before ours. Again. I quickly texted back, my fingers trembling. "What do you mean she needs you?" "The ceremony is about to begin." This time he replied almost immediately. "She says it's serious. I'll explain later." I felt the blood drain from my face. My bridesmaids noticed the change in my expression and rushed to my side, their faces filled with concern. "What is it, Clara?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with anxiety. "What's wrong?" I couldn't answer. All I could think about was the months of planning, the guests already seated, the vows we were about to exchange, and the fact that Ben was with her, instead of here, with me. I tried to compose myself, to convince everyone that it was just a small delay. "He's just working something out with his mom," I said, forcing a smile. "We'll start soon." But inside, I was panicking. Patricia's interference had been a constant presence in our relationship, but this was a new low. This was sabotage of the highest order. I could almost hear her smug voice whispering in my ear, "A mother always comes first." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The guests began to murmur, their confusion growing. My family looked at me with concern, while his family looked like they wanted to disappear into their seats. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I handed my bouquet to Sarah, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, and stormed out of the bridal suite. If Ben wouldn't come to me, I would go to him. I found him in a small side room, pacing nervously, his cell phone pressed to his ear. He looked up as I walked in, guilt written all over his face. "She's really not feeling well," he began, as if that would explain everything. "I think she needs to go to the hospital." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean she's not feeling well? Everyone's waiting." "The ceremony is about to start, and you're here worrying about her?" "It's our wedding day," he exclaimed, running a hand through his hair. "She called me crying. She said she couldn't breathe. I had to come right away. I had to check on her." I felt my anger boil over, a searing wave of fury that threatened to consume me. "So you left me, on our wedding day, because your mother, who has done nothing but try to sabotage us from the moment we got engaged, wanted attention?" "She's my mother, Clara," he said almost defensively. What was I supposed to do? Ignore her? I could feel my heart breaking, piece by piece. It wasn't just about today. It was about every moment leading up to this one. Every time he had chosen her over me. Every time he had let her disrespect me without standing up for me. This was the culmination of it all. The ultimate betrayal. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Am I not supposed to matter? Shouldn't I come first, today of all days?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and helplessness. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that he would never choose me, not truly. He would always be tethered to his mother, bound by an invisible cord of obligation and guilt. I turned and stormed out of the room, tears streaming down my face. I didn't care who saw me. All I could think about was how I had let myself believe that this day would be different, that he would finally choose me. Back in the ballroom, the guests were still waiting, their confusion now mixed with a palpable sense of unease. The murmur of conversation had died down, replaced by an awkward silence. I could feel their eyes on me, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. I walked to the front of the room, my legs feeling like lead. Sarah tried to stop me, grabbing my arm and whispering, "Clara, what are you doing? Are you okay?" I shook her off gently. "I have to do this," I said, my voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself for what I was about to do. I looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of friends, family, and acquaintances, all expecting a celebration, a joyous union. Instead, they were about to witness a spectacular collapse. "There will be no wedding today," I said, my voice cracking but loud enough to be heard. "Thank you all for coming, but it's over." A collective gasp swept through the room. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by a few scattered whispers of shock and disbelief. I didn't offer any explanations. I couldn't. The words were trapped in my throat, choked by a combination of grief, anger, and humiliation. I just stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the weight of what I had just done. Then, I turned and walked away. The faces in the crowd blurred as I made my way towards the exit. I could feel their eyes on me, burning into my back. I could hear their whispers, their speculation, their judgment. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to escape, to disappear, to crawl into a hole and never come out. Sarah and the other bridesmaids followed me, their faces pale with shock and concern. "Clara, what happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What did Ben say?" I couldn't bring myself to explain. My chest felt hollow, as if the air had been sucked out of me. I just shook my head and kept walking. I went to the dressing room, locked the door, and collapsed onto the floor in my wedding dress. The silence was deafening, broken only by the muffled voices of the guests outside, speculating about what had gone wrong. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the makeup I had so carefully applied now streaked with tears. The elaborate hairstyle I had spent hours perfecting was starting to unravel. My wedding dress, once a symbol of hope and promise, now felt like a shroud. I looked like a broken doll, a discarded toy. Minutes turned into hours. The sounds outside the dressing room gradually subsided, replaced by a heavy silence. I imagined the guests leaving, their faces a mixture of confusion and disappointment. I imagined my family trying to salvage the situation, to explain the unexplainable. I imagined Ben standing alone, realizing the magnitude of what he had done. Finally, I heard my cell phone buzzing on the table. I ignored it the first few times, but the buzzing didn't stop. It was a persistent, insistent reminder of the world outside, a world I no longer wanted to be a part of. Reluctantly, I picked it up. His name was flashing on the screen. Ben. My heart pounded in my chest. I hesitated before answering. What could he possibly say? What excuse could he possibly offer? Finally, I swiped the screen and answered the call. "Clara," he said immediately, his voice shaky, full of guilt. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You left me today, Ben. You left me for her." "She's my mom," he repeated, as if that explained everything. "She wasn't feeling well. What was I supposed to do?" "Are you listening to yourself?" I snapped. "You were supposed to marry me today, not play nursemaid to your mother. You were supposed to put me first. Just this once." There was a long pause, a heavy silence that stretched between us. Then, he said the words I had been dreading, the words that confirmed my worst fears. "I didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She needed me." I hung up the phone. There was no point in arguing. His loyalty had always been to her, not to me, and I finally realized that wasn't going to change. I stayed in that dressing room for what felt like hours, replaying everything that had happened, the ceremony that wasn't, the people waiting, the man I was supposed to marry choosing his mother over me. It was like a bad dream, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, I would have to face the world, to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. When I finally walked out of the dressing room, the hall was eerily quiet. Most of the guests had retreated to the reception area, their faces etched with confusion and concern. The remnants of the wedding, discarded programs, half-empty glasses, scattered petals, lay scattered around like debris after a storm. My sister, Emily, found me first. She didn't bombard me with questions or offer empty platitudes. She just wrapped her arms around me in a tight, silent hug. It was the first genuine comfort I'd felt all day. "You don't have to explain anything right now," she said, her voice soft. "Let me take care of the guests. Go home. Rest." I wanted to disappear, to fade into the background and let Emily handle everything. But I couldn't. As much as I wanted to avoid it, I knew I owed these people an explanation, even if it was just a small part of the truth. I took a deep breath and stepped into the reception area. All eyes turned to me. The low hum of conversation stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I felt every look, every unspoken question. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking. "There will be no wedding today. I hope you understand." There were murmurs of understanding, some nods of sympathy, and a few lingering expressions of shock, but no one pressed me for details. I couldn't have provided them even if I wanted to. The weight of it all was too much. After that, I left. I couldn't bear to stay there, surrounded by the ghosts of what could have been. Emily stayed behind to smooth things over with the guests, to offer a vague explanation about a family emergency. I knew she would handle it with grace and diplomacy, shielding me from the worst of the gossip and speculation. I went home to my apartment, took off the wedding dress I had been dreaming about for months, and sat on my bed, staring at the wall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sob that racked my body. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The hours after I left the reception were a blur. I sat in silence, still in disbelief at what had just happened. The man I was supposed to marry, the man who had promised to build a life with me, had abandoned me on our wedding day to cater to his mother's whims. I couldn't bring myself to respond to the flood of texts and phone calls from friends and family. Some messages were kind, full of concern and support. Others were nosy, demanding details about what had happened. I ignored them all. Instead, I replayed the day's events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised. Patricia had always been a problem in our relationship, constantly interfering with our decisions and making it clear that she didn't think I was good enough for her son. But this wasn't just another instance of her meddling. This was supposed to be our day, our moment to begin our life together. And he had chosen her. Again. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I had ignored so many red flags, telling myself that things would get better after the wedding. But this wasn't something that was going to magically change with a ring. It was a fundamental flaw in our relationship, a deep-seated dynamic that I could no longer ignore. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. There was no saving this relationship. If he couldn't put me first on our wedding day, he never would. The next morning, I awoke with a strange sense of clarity. The hurt and embarrassment were still there, a dull ache in my chest, but they had been joined by something else. Resolve. The sleep, though fitful, had allowed me to process some of the initial shock and replace it with something akin to steel. I realized that the wedding day wasn't just a one-time mistake or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was the culmination of a pattern I had ignored for far too long. His mother's meddling, his inability to stand up to her, his constant excuses. It was all part of the same problem, a problem that was now, definitively, his, and not mine. I spent the day packing his things, every photo of us, every piece of clothing he had left at my apartment, every little trinket and memento from our relationship went into a cardboard box. It felt almost surgical, like I was removing a tumor that had been slowly poisoning my system. As I folded his shirts and put away the little tokens of our life together, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for what might have been, for the future we had planned together. Relief at finally seeing the truth, at finally freeing myself from the toxic dynamic that had consumed our relationship. That afternoon, I sent him a text message. "I packed your things. Please come pick them up. We're done. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, but it didn't have to be. I didn't want another fight, another round of excuses, another tearful plea for forgiveness. I just wanted to move on, to close this chapter of my life and start writing a new one. When he showed up later that evening, I didn't let him in. I met him at the door, the box of his belongings sitting at my feet like a physical representation of our broken relationship. I avoided his eyes, refusing to let him see the pain that still lingered beneath the surface. "This is what you wanted, right?" I said, keeping my voice calm and steady despite the turmoil churning inside me. He tried to explain, to tell me how complicated things had been, how he had been caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his love for me. But I wasn't interested in hearing it. His words were just noise, empty promises that I knew he couldn't keep. "You weren't caught in the middle, Ben," I said firmly. You chose her, and now I'm choosing to end this." He looked like he wanted to argue, to protest, to beg me to reconsider, but I didn't give him the chance. I picked up the box, thrust it into his arms, and shut the door in his face. After he left with his box of belongings, the silence in my apartment was deafening. It was a silence that echoed with the weight of what I had just done, the finality of my decision, the weight of my loneliness. I sat on the couch and stared at the empty space where our future had once felt so certain. It wasn't just the wedding that had fallen apart. It was the life I'd imagined with him, the dreams we had shared, the family we had hoped to create. For months, I had ignored the warning signs, telling myself that love would be enough to fix everything. But now, sitting alone in my empty apartment, I knew better. Love wasn't always enough. Sometimes you had to choose yourself, even if it meant breaking your own heart. The texts and calls kept coming, a relentless barrage of concern and curiosity. Friends and family wanted answers, updates, assurances that I was okay. I appreciated their support, but I didn't have the energy to respond. The last thing I wanted was to relive the humiliation of my wedding day by explaining it to everyone over and over again. Over the next few days, I began to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I canceled the honeymoon, notified the remaining vendors, and wrote thank you notes to the few guests who had reached out with genuine kindness instead of prying questions. Each task felt like another reminder of what I'd lost, but it also gave me a sense of control in the chaos. I was taking charge of my life again, reclaiming my agency after months of feeling like a pawn in Patricia's twisted game. Then came the social media fallout. It was inevitable, I suppose. Someone, probably a distant relative or a gossipy acquaintance, had posted about the canceled wedding on Facebook. Within hours, the story had spread like wildfire, fueled by speculation and conjecture. Soon, everyone seemed to know. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as people shared the post, commented on it, and tagged me in it. I saw the comments, a chaotic mix of sympathy and judgment. What happened? Was she dumped? Did they fight? I heard she's always been difficult. I avoided reading too much into it, knowing it would only make me feel worse. Social media is a highlight reel, a carefully curated performance of happiness and success. It wasn't a place for raw, messy emotions or complex situations, and what had happened to me was nothing if not complex. But in the quiet moments when the apartment was silent and the only sound was the ticking of the clock, the doubts crept in. Was it my fault? Was I too demanding, too critical? Should I have tried harder to get along with Patricia? These thoughts haunted me, even though deep down I knew the answer. It wasn't my fault, it was Ben's. He had let Patricia control him, let her manipulate our relationship until there was nothing left. He had prioritized his mother's approval over my happiness, my feelings, my worth. It was about a week after the wedding that wasn't when he showed up at my door again. I wasn't expecting him, but I wasn't surprised. Ben had never been one to let things go easily, and I figured he'd want to try to explain himself, if not to me, then to his own conscience. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. The confident, easygoing charm that had first attracted me to him was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like guilt. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, arms folded, waiting for him to speak. Let him stand on the welcome mat and stew in what he'd done. I screwed up, he finally said, his voice low and hoarse. I didn't say anything. I'd heard enough from him on the wedding day, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear any more. But he went on, as if he couldn't stop himself. She's my mother, Clara, he said, repeating the same excuse he'd used countless times before. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I realize how much I hurt you. I should have stood by you. I should have protected you. Hearing him admit it should have felt satisfying, a validation of everything I had felt for months. But it didn't. It just made me angrier. Why now? I wanted to ask. Why couldn't you see that before you walked out on me in front of everyone we know? Why did it take a canceled wedding for you to realize what you were losing? Instead, I let him speak. Let him spill out his regrets and apologies, his promises to change, to set boundaries with his mother, to finally put me first. He begged for another chance, promised that this time, things would be different. Part of me wanted to believe him. I had loved him once, deeply and completely, and a small, stubborn part of me still did. The familiarity, the shared history, the comfortable routine. It was all so tempting. But I'd heard these promises before, and I wasn't sure I could trust them anymore. The wedding day had been a stark, undeniable illustration of his priorities, and I didn't think I could ever forget it. You're too late, Ben, I finally said, my voice steady but firm. I needed you to choose me that day, and you didn't. I don't think I can get past that. He looked like he was going to argue, to plead, to try to convince me that he deserved another chance. But I shut the door before he could say anything else. I wasn't going to let him drag me back into that toxic cycle, back into a relationship where I was always second best. After I closed the door on him, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. His apology, though long overdue, didn't erase what had happened. It didn't fix the humiliation I'd felt or the realization that he would always put his mother first. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice. I had chosen myself. I had spent so much of our relationship compromising, bending, and trying to please him and his mother. It was exhausting, and it had cost me more than I realized. My self-respect, my confidence, my sense of self-worth. It was time to reclaim all of that. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects and pushing myself creatively. I caught up with friends I hadn't seen much during the chaos of wedding planning, rediscovering the joy of their companionship and the comfort of their unwavering support. I even started a new hobby, pottery. I'd always been drawn to tactile arts, but I never seemed to have the time or the inclination to pursue them. Now, with my weekend suddenly free, I signed up for a beginner's class at a local studio. The feel of the clay between my fingers was grounding, almost meditative. It forced me to focus on the present moment, to quiet the swirling thoughts in my head. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a formless lump of earth and shaping it into something beautiful, something new. Social media eventually moved on from the wedding drama, as social media always does. The posts stopped, the comments faded away, and the online world found something new to obsess over. It was a relief. The messages and calls from well-meaning friends slowed down, and I found myself enjoying the quiet. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when I felt the weight of it all, the sadness, the loneliness, the lingering embarrassment. But I reminded myself that this was a new beginning, not an ending, that I wasn't defined by what had happened, but by how I chose to respond to it. As for Ben, I heard bits and pieces of his life through mutual friends. He was still trying to navigate the complexities of his relationship with his mother, still struggling to assert his independence. He was still, in essence, her little boy. It wasn't my problem anymore, and I had no intention of letting him back into my life. I knew I had dodged a bullet, escaped a lifetime of taking second place, of constantly fighting for his attention and respect. And while it hurt to go through what I went through, I was grateful for the strength it had given me. I had learned a valuable lesson about self-worth, about boundaries, about the importance of choosing myself, even when it's the hardest thing to do. One night, while scrolling through Instagram, I came across a quote that resonated with me deeply. Sometimes closing a door isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new space. It felt fitting, a perfect encapsulation of where I was in my life. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew that I would never again let anyone, not a partner, and certainly not his mother, control my happiness or dictate my worth. I would never let anyone dim my light. Months passed, and life began to settle into something resembling peace. The chaos of the wedding, the humiliation, the heartbreak, they were still there, faint scars on my heart, but they no longer defined me. They no longer consumed my thoughts or dictated my actions. I was finally starting to see a future that didn't revolve around Ben, around his expectations, around his mother's approval. A future that was entirely my own. In the time since the wedding that wasn't, I had rediscovered parts of myself that I had almost forgotten. My creativity, my sense of humor, my adventurous spirit. I laughed more, spent time with people who truly cared about me, and allowed myself to dream again, without the weight of unrealistic expectations or the fear of disappointment. The idea of love didn't feel so daunting anymore. It felt like something I could finally embrace, but this time on my own terms. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me or to validate my worth. I was looking for someone to share my life with, someone who respected my boundaries and celebrated my individuality. Someone who knew a mother's love and support was important, but a partnership came first. One evening, I found myself sitting in a park near my apartment. The air was crisp, the leaves were changing color, and the sky was ablaze with the fiery hues of sunset. I had a book in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly content. It wasn't about finding someone else, or proving anything to anyone, or even about forgetting what had happened. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose and self-assurance. It was about reclaiming my life, my happiness, and my worth. The wedding that wasn't had taught me a lesson I never expected to learn, a lesson that had ultimately transformed me for the better. It had taught me that sometimes losing someone can be the best thing that ever happened to you. That sometimes the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to walk away. As for Ben, I heard bits and pieces of his life through mutual friends. He and Patricia were as intertwined as ever, their dynamic unchanged despite the upheaval of the wedding disaster. He had dated a couple of women since, but none of them had lasted. I heard through the grapevine that his difficulty setting boundaries with his mother was a recurring issue. It wasn't my concern anymore. I knew I had dodged a life of taking second place, of constantly fighting for his attention and respect. I had escaped a future where my worth was contingent on his mother's approval. And while it hurt to go through what I went through, I was ultimately grateful for the strength it had given me. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine, and I was determined to make it a beautiful one, and I was doing it alone, and I was okay. Maybe even better than okay. I smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and opened my book, ready to lose myself in a new story, a new world, a world that I was now free to create for myself. My own beautiful, messy, imperfect, and utterly independent world.